The MPA Capstone Project. Outlining your project. Your capstone project consists of a project essay in the form of a 12-page memorandum, a separate executive summary memorandum as a 2-page memorandum, and a slide presentation of the project in 12 slides. This week, you are to submit an outline of your project along with a draft of the introduction section. Let's review the organization of your primary memorandum. The primary memorandum has 7 major sections, and in this media lecture, we will review what goes into each of the major sections. The sections are the introduction, the assessment of the problem, the literature review, the stakeholder analysis, the options specification, the options analysis, and the recommendation. The first section of your primary memorandum is the introduction. You introduce your project, your client, your role, and you explain the action-forcing event. After reading this section, your reader should understand what the project will be about, who your client is, what your role is, what the action-forcing event is. And remember, the action-forcing event should grab the interest of your client and your reader. The introduction should be interesting to your client and your reader. The second section of your capstone project is the assessment of the problem. It needs to include a problem assessment and a policy assessment. In the problem assessment, you examine what the problem is. Why did the action-forcing event happen? How did we get to the current situation? What is the historical timeline? What's happened thus far? What's the background on the underlying problem? Perhaps there is a real problem that is different than the apparent problem. Can you describe the problem objectively using data? Are there measures of the problem that you could present? The assessment of the policy needs to examine how policy can or does influence the problem. Did policy or a lack of policy play a role in the evolution of the problem? You will introduce the policy that is the subject of your analysis. Some official statement, a law, an important rule, a regulation, an official statement of prioritization. You need to be able to identify where the policy can be located. This is critical. If you cannot put your finger on your policy, does it really exist? And then you need to identify who's responsible for the policy. Can your client change the policy? If not, are you addressing your project to the right client? Now, it is possible that there is no policy and that that's the problem, in which case you need to explain that there's no policy, and you also need to explain why one is needed and where it would go. Perhaps it would be a new section of an existing policy. Perhaps it would be an amendment to a law that would provide more policy guidance than exists now. Perhaps it would be some kind of resolution of official intent by the city council or the legislature, but it's necessary for you to say that part of the reason for the problem is the lack of the policy, and then for you to say where it is that the change or changes might be made. Another section of your project is the literature review. Typically, in a term paper, your literature review might go on for 10 or 15 pages. And since this is a 12-page memorandum, that will not be possible. This has to be a very concise summary of the literature that is intended to be an informative explanation to your client about the state of knowledge about the problem that your project concerns. So consider three basic questions. What is known about the local problem? For example, are there reports, agency studies, independent studies, news articles? Another concern is the state of scholarly knowledge. Is the problem that you've identified something that has been researched by academics? Are there peer-reviewed journal articles? Are there scholarly books and professional studies? Remember that you don't have to identify all of them. That's not going to be practical in the space available. So you may want to find a definitive review of the literature and reference the review of the literature and the findings of the review of the literature rather than presenting each document yourself. A third focus of your literature review should involve what are the best practices in other jurisdictions. Are there professional reports about how best to go about doing the work that is entailed by the topic that you've selected? A few cautions are in order. While it is important for you to rely on other studies, be aware of the plagiarism policies of the college. You cannot copy other studies. You can quote from them, in which case you would have a citation for the quote, or you can summarize them in your own words. But even if you cite a literature review, you can't simply lift the words of a paragraph from the literature review and put them in your project unless you quote them. But if you have a literature review which is essentially a quotation from another literature review, this would also be unsatisfactory. Another section of your project is the stakeholder analysis, sometimes referred to as the environmental scan. This is a political roadmap of key influential organizations and officials. 4 to 6 officials or organizations are highlighted, and 6 to 12 decision characteristics are studied. The key questions involve who has to support your client to implement change, who is opposing change and why, who benefits from the current situation. These are the issues addressed in your stakeholder analysis. Another section is your option specification. Remember that your project must identify 3 to 5 options for policy changes to your client. Each must involve a change to the policy that you've identified. And this section explains the options that you're proposing to consider. Typically, the options are presented in a table which summarizes what change is involved, who is responsible for implementation, how this might help ameliorate the problem, and what the stakeholders think about the option. Another section of your capstone memorandum is the options assessment. Here is where you analyze the policy options that you identified in the previous section and arrive at a recommendation as to which is the best approach that your client should consider implementing. There are 5 basic assessment dimensions in your options assessment. These are political feasibility. Central to the political feasibility assessment is the stakeholder analysis. Are there options which receive consensus support by most of the stakeholders? Are there options which are completely unacceptable to certain important stakeholders? A second dimension is administrative feasibility. Is implementation of a particular option very, very complex compared to another which is very simple? Also, are there legal constraints that would require a lot of additional administrative work in order to implement a particular policy? A third dimension is financial feasibility. Does one option save money? Does one option cost nothing, but perhaps not save anything? And does another option cost a lot? Your assessment would need to assess the cost effect of the options that you've identified. Equity. This dimension concerns fairness. For example, is there a particular stakeholder group that would be very disadvantaged by a particular option? And would this make the option unacceptable? Would an option have civil rights consequences? Would it, say, have a negative effect on certain protected groups? Would it have an adverse effect in one neighborhood compared to another neighborhood? The basic question here is whether an option is fair, or at least as fair as possible, to all concerned. Finally, the fifth dimension is effectiveness. In the end, will each policy option actually achieve the result that it is intended to achieve? You might have an option, for example, that is very satisfactory to all of the stakeholders, but which your scholarly literature review identifies as being impractical. It may be something that has not worked when it was tried in other jurisdictions, but nevertheless is extremely popular. So effectiveness is an important dimension you need to assess. The last section of your capstone project is your recommendation. Based on your options assessment, you must recommend one or perhaps two of your options. Consider the arguments for and against the recommendation, and close your memorandum with a summary defense of your recommendation. Your project memorandum is like a sandwich. The introduction is at the top, and the recommendation is at the bottom, and the other 5 sections fit in between. In summary, 5 problems to avoid are: first, don't choose a topic that's too large and complex, and don't turn a simple topic into something that is more large and complex than it needs to be. Second, don't choose a topic that doesn't involve a policy that can be the key to problem solving. Third, don't spend too much time and effort on one section, neglecting the others. Fourth, don't leave out key sections of your project. And fifth, don't exceed the 12-page limit. Thank you.